Hello and welcome to For the Love of Creatives. I am your host, Dwight, joined by Maddox, and today we are joined by Lindsey Kirkendall. Lindsey, welcome to the podcast. Could you share just a little bit about yourself for listeners?
Absolutely. And I'm super excited to be here. So thank you for having me.
We're
This is
glad to
always
have you.
challenging. Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here. But these are always challenging questions for me because I tend to be a little long-winded. So I'm going to try to do my best to keep it in a nutshell, and y'all can cut me off or ask a question. Feel free to jump in if you need to divert me.
All right.
But my story, if you will, I'm originally from Southern California, so I grew up very much wanting to be in the entertainment industry. I was very drawn to the performing arts, always wanted to be a dancer, et cetera, et cetera. Finally convinced my mother to allow me to get an agent when I was about 13. So I did some commercial work and started to do some work in film, just really scratching the surface. I did have some national commercials, which was cool, but nothing significant that you would have heard of. Um, but I did a lot of work in that world during that time, during high school, and then a little bit in college. Continued to pursue the arts. I danced in college. I sang in a vocal jazz ensemble in college, and actually have an award for vocal jazz solo hanging above.
Nice.
Very proud of
Love
that.
that.
But I always just was drawn to the entertainment world. I was drawn to the performing arts. I loved musical theater, wanted to do all of it. And got to a point when I was about 21 that I was so burnt out on LA and understanding who I am now, I'm like, oh, that I couldn't have articulated why I was burnt out, but I understand now why I was like, I need to get the hell out of here. And I still wanted to be in an entertainment city because I wanted to continue to pursue that professionally. But New York felt like more of the same, and it was colder and it was further away from my family. So I picked Nashville and
Nice.
met my husband there. I met him 6 months after I moved. He, in his own right, is a phenomenally brilliant genius, musician, songwriter, producer, all of the things. And we have been married almost 20 years. It'll be 20 years in May. And
Congratulations.
thank you. Yeah. Um, and so we have kind of built a world together where we have got to continue to pursue a lot of our creative passions. But we also had 5 years after we married, we had our first son, and then we had another one 2 years later. And so that was for me a big part of what I wanted. I was not one of the women that was like career first and then babies. I was like, I'm going to have both and I'm going to do it great. And it was not a one without the other kind of thing. So it was a big kind of, again, talking about becoming. I know that's a big theme for you guys now. It was a big, ongoing, probably decade plus process for me of doing a lot of internal work around trying to pursue a professional career because I continued to have an agent even in Nashville, and I was acting and modeling and singing and doing background vocal work, and I was getting to do a lot of fun things, but had really zero guidance. I did not come from a family that understood the arts. They were very religious. They didn't want their daughter participating in that industry. So I just didn't have a lot of support and I didn't have a lot of guidance. I was totally flying solo with all of it and got married very young. We got married, I was 22. So, when you get married, a lot of things shift in perspective. Now we have to pay bills and we have to, do a lot of other adult type things that divert energy from just pursuing the arts and pursuing performing and music and all of these things. So, we were trying to still build these creative careers, but also adding more adult responsibilities onto our plate at the same time. So my life kind of went like this, and I was serving two masters pretty significantly very early on. And I wanted both, but I had to, like I said, I went through this ongoing, decade plus process of really having to re-evaluate all of my internal beliefs around what it meant to be a female artist, be a female artist that was a mother, be a businesswoman, because now I was like, well, I want to be at home with my kids. I don't work well in the corporate world. Tried that a number of times. Not the place for me. And I wanted to create a flexible, reality where I could be with kids, still help provide, um, and have, both of those things. And I was, this was all during the era of like 2008 to 2012 when the internet was really, really coming online for particularly for artists and them starting to understand that they didn't have to go through these gatekeepers anymore to have a career
Mhm.
and they could connect with their audience directly. And one thing, again, I didn't really understand about myself back then. I knew I could do things, but I didn't know why. So, like, I was very good at being able to read people's unconscious beliefs.
Mhm.
I was very good at helping people to understand what was happening in the un or subconscious. It just was how I'm wired. I could see that. And so, because my husband and I were both working in the music business, he was producing full time at that point. We started to get a lot of opportunities or artists asking us to manage them, but we didn't want to manage, but we loved mentorship and we loved educating and we loved guiding.
Mhm.
So we started a business that was a production and consulting company. So I was really just doing business consulting for artists, helping them understand how to build businesses online and also helping them to reframe what the possibilities were, because that was the part that I like really, really loved. And I really loved helping artists. Well, let me say it this way. What I was noticing in my work with artists is that part of the reason, or I don't know if I'm being honest, I think like the fundamental reason that they were struggling so much was not for a lack of knowledge or strategy or know-how, but it was because they were still really committed to their career looking the way that the industry had worked for the last 100 years. And they were
Yeah.
trying to apply that way of doing things to this whole new world. And it didn't work. And so there was a lot of really just by virtue of the work that we were doing and trying to help teach them strategy and business strategy, was I got to like really help them see how they were overly focused on this archaic way of doing things and way of doing things that were really disempowering, and
Mhm.
didn't place the power solely on their shoulders. And so it was a really beautiful time for me to really understand that like my gift, my value to artists was really more in helping them better understand who they were, help them have a more deeper connection to their artistry, to who they were as artists. We talked a little bit before we started recording about how when we're kids, we get asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? But Maddox, you said it wasn't about the being, it was how did you phrase that?
Well, I
Or the
said,
do.
there's a what do you want to be and there's a who do you want to be. One is
Right.
an external process and one is an internal process.
Yeah.
We assume that most of our listeners are already determined that they want to be creative in some shape, form, or fashion. So we don't address the what.
Yeah.
We spend our time and energy on the who you want to
Ooh.
become in order to be that creative person, that artist, that dancer, that singer, whatever. Who is it in here, inside of yourself, that you have to become?
Right. Yeah. And I was finding that helping people discover that was more transformational to their success than teaching them how to do social media strategy correctly. And
Yeah.
I
You were cutting
love that
edge.
work.
I just want to call that out. You were cutting edge.
Yeah. And it was hard. It's funny. I was having this conversation the other day because I said, it was hard because no one lays awake in bed at night going, I really need to change my limiting beliefs. They go, I really need to have more audience members on my social media. You know, that one.
Facts.
Exactly. We focus on the what and forget about the who we
Yeah,
need to be in order to get those additional people on our
right,
as our followers.
right. And so it was a really interesting marketing path because I did feel a little bit like, am I bait and switching these people? Because I'm telling them I can help them build their social media, but what they don't realize is I have them start at a more subconscious level first, and we work through those pieces first before the strategy even makes sense, or we even know what the strategy is going to be. Um,
You know, I
so
had a mentor one time say that whole bait and switch thing. I had a mentor one time tell me sometimes you have to give them what they want so you can give them what they need.
that's really good. And it's
Yeah.
true. It's very true. But to tie up all of that, I mean, essentially through the process of getting the opportunity to work with a number of different types of artists and also at that time raising kids, small kids, they're 12 and 14 now, but I, really started to feel passionately about supporting particularly female artists during that season because, you know, there is a difference between what a male artist's path and trajectory looks like versus a female artist's path and trajectory. And I'm saying this with the assumption that in general, most females desire to have a family. I know it's not true for everybody, but most tend to want to have that be a part of their life experience. And we have a lot of different competing things that men don't have to contend with as they're building their career as a creative, one of which is you have to look young and sexy or you're not valuable,
Yeah.
right? There's a ticking time clock. There's also, I think, a more intuitive, unconscious awareness that, like, we want to be good parents. And if we are going to choose the path of becoming a mother one day, that we want to have enough time and energy and capacity to do that job well. And if we're still trying to get a career off the ground, but our biological clock is ticking, that creates a really weird push pull that's very, very stressful on women that are trying to both build a career during their fertile years. Like it's funky. So we have these other things that we're dealing with that really there wasn't anyone in the space at that time that was really talking about these things and helping to empower women and help them navigate that push pull.
You know, I think it's also important to call out, maybe not in every society, but certainly in our society, we still very much live in a man's world.
Yeah,
The
we
the,
do.
pa the patriarch is alive and well, and I wish I could say that that wasn't true because if it was up to me, it wouldn't be.
Yeah.
I'm very much into equality and equity, but it is still, when you go in and look at the wages, men are still across the board pretty much paid better than women are.
Yeah.
And, you guys have to live to a whole different set of standards
Mm-hmm.
and not fair, but it is what it is.
But it is what it is. Yeah. And a lot of that are things that we unconsciously uh, understand from a very small age and learn through osmosis. And it's never explicitly said, but we just absorb that, and try to navigate without a whole lot of people, without a whole lot of guidance, I would say. So in about 2018, I really pivoted my practice to focusing primarily on female artists. I still did work with men, but it was focused and marketed towards female artists. And I did that I still do some of it from time to time. I've got an artist right now that I'm working with actually, but I did that very full time for about 5 years. And then now I'm pivoting. I did go in 2022, I actually went through a summer certification course on clinical hypnotherapy because I found it to be really, really transformational in the life of myself and my husband. And so I wanted to add that to my practice, but at the time I didn't really know that I was going to be pivoting from doing as much one-to-one client work as I had been. So I didn't really get a chance to practice that as much as I was hoping I would, but have decided at the end of last year to start another certification course in a methodology called rapid transformational therapy. And it's about an 18-month course where you get like level 3 certified as a master hypnotherapist. So I'm excited about that because it really is kind of like, oh, all of these things that I was seeing in my clients, and I really enjoyed like that deeper psychological subconscious work. Now I actually am going to be accredited and certified and be able to support artists with deeper subconscious level work instead of like, hey, it's like what you said earlier, Maddox, give them what they think they want to give them what they need, you know. But now I can just say, hey, like it's the subconscious that's driving everything.
Everything.
And
I
so
think
I would love to
hypnosis
help
is
you clear
phenomenal.
that.
Yeah.
So yeah. And then as it relates to, again, going back to becoming, and a little bit of my story there is after I pivoted away from serving clients in a really high level one-to-one capacity, I went through a period of burnout in my late 30s and early 40s. And I mean, I'm still in my early 40s, but I was just like, I don't know why I can't seem to energetically get it up to go back and do this work with artists right now. I just didn't really know. Our boys were, we had homeschooled them for the majority of their life. And then they did like a couple years in a traditional school. And then we brought them back home last year to homeschool. So this is like year 2 of homeschooling again, round 2.
Mhm.
And that does require some of my presence, but I also felt kind of in this amorphous soup of where am I going next professionally? Because I'm a really high energy person. I love learning, and I want to, use that energy in a way that helps humanity. And I still am so passionate about serving the creative community and in turn serving myself because I'm a member of the creative community.
Mhm.
And so I was like, what next, universe? Like where are we going next? Because I don't think I want to go back to what I was doing, but I can't quite put my finger on what the next step is. And um, it was like through raising my kids and seeing behaviors in both my kids that caused my husband and I to scratch our heads a little bit, like, is that autism? Is that ADHD? But never like when you sit down to read the profile of these like traditional behaviors, never really felt like, yeah, they check all the boxes. This is a clear, we need to go see someone to get a diagnosis. And our kids were functioning and thriving and doing fine. But also, there were things where we're like, that's not quite what you would expect to see. And it didn't really become very obvious to us until our boys were getting like at middle school age. And so I started to research, and we had some evaluation done early on when they were homeschooling because it was recommended to me because I was like, if I continue to homeschool, I just want to know how my kids learn, right? So
Yeah.
we had a psychoeducational evaluation done and did cognitive skills and things like this. And both of them came back in the gifted range from like a IQ screener. It wasn't a full scale IQ test. So we're like, well, we knew we were dealing with bright kids. And um, also, like, both of our kids had some like claircognizant moments as children where they knew things that they shouldn't have known or predicted things that's a whole other bottle of wine. But either way, like we knew we were operating with some like really tapped in children here. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
And so as I researched giftedness, and of course, giftedness is often cousins with neurodivergence or is considered a form of neurodivergence. And one of the things that just kept coming back and back and back is, well, it's genetic. It travels in families. You see it in families often. Um, and so again, going through that period of burnout and observing my kids coming to an age where like some of those differences were becoming more apparent, I I was like, oh, like, am I maybe on the spectrum? Like, am I neurodivergent? And all that to say, for many reasons, which again, I'm for the sake of brevity, told you I was long-winded. I warned you. So you can't be mad. But but I came to discovery that like I was like, I am very confident in self-diagnosing myself as being on the spectrum.
And
And
what changed for you?
everything. Like it was weird because what I was observing in my internal experience was how intensely and I assume the mainstream populace really has come to understand autism to look very, very like this very specific thing. Because I don't think anyone would ever look at me and be like, she's autistic. I look people in the eye. I'm very social. I'm very capable in social situations. Like all of these traditional things that people ascribe to autism, not me.
Well, you got to admit that the marketing for autism spectrum disorder was pretty powerful. I mean,
Oh,
Rain
yeah.
Man was a really popular movie.
It was absolutely. And so that was one of my biggest shocks when I was learning this about myself was, of course, I never saw myself inside of this because we were only looking at it through this narrow lens of, I call it white boy autism because it's like, you probably know too, like the studies that were where the diagnostic criteria was created were done on like upper middle class white boys.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, then it's gonna, my oldest son, I would say, has traditional white boy autism. It's much more obvious for him because he likes tornadoes and cars, you know?
Hmm.
And he can struggle a little bit with social cues and some social challenges, and he's very monotropic and like it's like very obvious white boy autism to me. And so in women, and especially women that find out much later in life, I was 41 when I found out, very, very different experience, but also becoming aware of like, oh, all these things that didn't really add up, now it all clicks into place. So the thing that really changed for me beyond observing what was happening like with the collective awareness and how I was never going to understand myself inside of that because we all thought it looked like A, but I'm over here like looking like X or something.
Hmm.
And when I realized, okay, that's interesting, but also personally, it was like everything clicked into focus in a way that it never had before. The exhaustion, the burnouts, the high intensity like need for lots of like learning and stimulation in that way, certain like internal sensitivities that particularly for women are not obvious because high masking, again, these are terms that I use just based on what I've researched, but women that like may have autism but fit in socially and can hide in
Hmm.
most scenarios, their experience of their autism is very, very internal. So no one really understands or sees it. But it just, once I understood that about myself, then I started to take that lens into like the world of creatives and the world that I was in and the people that I was serving. And I'm like, oh, now I can
Yeah.
see it everywhere.
Well, and it sounds
Yeah.
like you brought along with you a lot of the things that you had used in working with your clients to get them to excel despite how they had to perform for the male gaze.
Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
I can definitely see how the masking behavior is going to be very similar to how it is that you need to thread your way into get time in the right rooms and be taken seriously because you have to pretend to be a character.
Yeah. Yeah. And going back to what I said about like, oh, this is why I left LA was because while I loved performing and I loved acting because it was fun, I couldn't like, and I've heard this a lot in my research is just people with that tend to be on the spectrum like have very, very, what's the word? They just authenticity is very, very important to them.
Hmm.
Not being, and it's why some people that may have higher support needs can come across a little bit cold or overly direct because they just want clarity and they just want truth and authenticity. That's really important because if someone's shifty, it makes you feel unsafe.
Sure.
And so they're not going to be the person that's shifty, you know? And so I couldn't really gel in that environment because that's all LA is shiftiness and people jockeying for position and trying to play a role so they can, and that was just so overwhelming to my nervous system. I
Like a
couldn't
fish out
allow.
of water, wasn't it?
Yeah. And even though I looked the part, I was a cute blonde girl, I was bubbly, I was, intelligent and all of these things, like it was exhausting to me, and exhausting in a way that I didn't understand at the time. But now understanding neurodivergence, I was like, oh, makes total sense. And it was beautiful because I think for a long time I had a lot of shame that I didn't have the stamina or the willpower or the drive, even though I'm an incredibly determined and driven person. Everybody who knows me would characterize me that way. But I was like, well, I must not be driven enough because I wasn't able to hack it. I wasn't able to stick it out. I left. And now it's like, no, I was way too, and I use this term not in a bad way because I don't perceive it in a negative light, but I was way too sensitive for that bullshit. Like, and I had a higher standard, right? And I do think a lot of that is part of my neurodivergence.
Lindsay, you have been involved in the creative world for way, way, way longer than we have. You know, we kind of stumbled into creatives when we co-hosted an event 2.5 years ago with some artists, and it was all creatives that showed up for this event. And we had this awareness that, oh my God, we just found our people. We just felt right at home. And so most of our focus since then, most all of our focus has been on creatives. We've hosted events, we started this podcast, but we have about 2.5 years worth of experience in the creatives world, even though we've both been creative all of our lives.
Yeah.
Being in the creative community is a different thing.
Right.
You, on the other hand, have been involved a lot longer, so you have a much broader perspective. I mean, perhaps there's studies that you're aware of, but if you had to guess, what percentage of the creatives population do you think might be affected by some form of divergence or neurodivergence or something that's associated with that? Because I know there's different things like I don't I'm not smart enough about this topic to know, is ADHD, those initials always trip me up a little bit. Is that under the umbrella of neurodivergence or is that something completely separate?
No, it's under the umbrella. There's a lot of conversation because this is a developing area of research, right? Like it's still so new. There's so much that we're learning. And I've heard a lot of researchers say ADHD, autism, like, as long as there's not an intellectual disability also present, it's like, it's both sides of the same coin in some respects. So there's even some conversation of like, where does one end and where does the other begin? I do know, and you guys may have heard this statistic, but I do know that the people that are like at the front lines researching this, they say that they believe that at least, I'm probably going to botch this, but it's something along the lines of at least 50% of all of the people who are neurodivergent are not actually diagnosed. They don't know. Now, I'm not really sure how they came to that conclusion, but because I am someone who can dive really deep on a subject and consume a lot of information on it rapidly, I do feel like I become a lay expert on a lot of random topics. And this was one because it concerned my children, and then, for myself, and then also for my husband too. We're like, oh, all four of us are really neurodivergent, and like had no idea. And also no wonder there have been these things that we've struggled with for, our whole adult lives. Um, and I've just kind of felt like as I've better understood what it looks like, particularly in people who don't also have an intellectual disability, I'm like, I think the vast majority of the population, creatives or not, are probably neurodivergent on some level. I truly believe it. Because you think about it like this. This was something, if you've ever seen the movie Temple, have you guys seen that about Temple Grandin? That's
Yes.
you've seen
Yeah.
it?
Oh,
It's really
yes, yes, I
good.
have.
It's so good. And Claire Danes is amazing in that role. But, I watch a movie and then I'm like Wikipediaing on the side and like, reading about other things that they don't maybe explore heavily in the movie. And so I was looking at some articles and they've done brain scans on Temple's brain, and it shows how there's asymmetry in her brain, and one lobe is quite a bit larger than another lobe. And I'm like, okay, well, we haven't been doing brain scans on people like the way we do x-rays on kids, the way we do ultrasounds on almost every pregnant woman that ever exists, right? But we can on the external observe that no one's physical external appearance is symmetrical. No one.
Mhm.
We all have asymmetry on our external bodies. So stands to reason that we probably have asymmetry in our brains too. Now, to what degree, we don't really know unless we do a brain scan, but those are expensive and they're not mainstream, and we haven't decided collectively that that's a thing we do. So to your question, I think a lot of creatives are probably neurodivergent, and I think probably the majority of the population is to some degree. And
I
I'm
have to
using that,
wonder.
sorry, go
Oh,
ahead.
no, go ahead, finish.
I was just saying I'm using that like with my understanding. When I say neurodivergence, I mean brain asymmetry.
Mhm.
I have to wonder if there is something about the act of creation that attracts neurodivergence.
That's
Perhaps
an interesting
because,
thought.
we've interviewed between 50 and 60, not interviewed, I hate that word. We've had conversations for the podcast with between 50 and 60 people. And there have been like many of them that have told stories, described traits within themselves that look like
Yeah,
they fell into that category. It's the
yeah,
number of people that have said, "Oh, I'm dyslexic," or I'm ADHD," or I've a learning disability," or something like this. It's been, wouldn't you say, Dwight? It's been pretty almost common. Not everybody,
Well,
but
and I would say that the idea that we have of there being some neurotypical path that we can have in the human experience is probably a rare thing indeed. It's
yeah,
just that the culture enforces that this is what the majority of the mainstream should be experiencing.
yeah, absolutely. I think creativity is something that, well, I think neurodivergent people are drawn to creativity because their brain is already wired to see beauty, to experience beauty, to feel beauty, to resonate with art in a way that someone who is maybe more neurotypical looking may not notice, right? It just doesn't come into their system in the same way. Um, so I don't, that's not exactly what you asked, but that's one of the thoughts I've had as it relates to creatives. I think it's just we tend to have what would be really interesting is to take brain scans on creatives and see if there are certain parts of the brain that are more, neurons firing or whatever, or maybe bigger or whatever, if those brains all looked relatively similar because they're people that are drawn to beauty, drawn to expression. Um, and is it because of an actual like asymmetry in the brain or a different, physiology in the brain?
yeah, I think that would be fascinating.
Good.
Absolutely fascinating. I'd kind of like to jump forward a little bit and hear about you've described your entire family as being neurodivergent.
Yeah.
And so you talked about it made life make more sense when you understood those things about yourself. And I'm assuming that it also gave you clues into how you could more effectively navigate life from that place. Can we talk about that a little bit? Because I want to give it, I mean, if indeed creatives are neurodivergents are drawn to creativity and a big portion of our listeners are affected by this, I want to give them something that they can walk away with,
Mhm.
you know, even if it's just examples in your own life and your family's life about how you have learned to navigate some of the challenging aspects of that. Because I know that there is that gifted thing. You're not going to probably meet a neurodivergent that doesn't have some friggin' superpowers.
Absolutely.
And then there's the other angle, the parts of it that make their life kind of challenging. They process information differently, they process feelings differently, or I should say maybe we, because I've not been tested. I'm not so sure. I'm not part of that group myself. I wouldn't be a bit surprised. Let's go into that vein and share what you have, because you are so knowledgeable about this and have put so much time, energy. I know you have some great things to share.
I think for me, the most fundamental piece, again, going back to our subconscious mind and the beliefs that we hold, is that I don't see it as a disorder. I don't see it as a problem. I don't see it as something that is pathological. I've never experienced those things. Now I can understand that. Yes, I actually have, my stepsister has a daughter who has a very, very high support needs autistic child. And there are some intellectual disabilities there, but also there was a intense amount of trauma that brain developed in, right? So and I've heard that too, is like, is this actually autism, or is this an autistic brain that's experienced trauma? Some of these like diagnostic criteria. So for me, because I tend to believe that the majority of the population probably is neurodivergent to some degree. I also think that it can't be pathological then, can't be a disorder, can't be something that's bad. It's just different. Or is it? And maybe it's actually very not different. So I think the fact that I see it in that way really shapes how I interact with the parts of it that are challenging. I don't have a lot of shame around it. I don't have a lot of, I'm just like, yeah, this is how I operate. I know one really good example was when, I mean, again, been married almost 20 years, right? So we've been through the gamut of things with each other. And my husband is this absolutely genius, prolific musician and songwriter. He can sit down and like literally write 50 songs in a week. I mean, it's insane what he's able to produce. But he'll get into the kitchen and he's so focused and task oriented on eating that he won't see that he's left the kitchen not put away. Like once the task is done and he's fed himself, the task is done, you know? And because we've always worked from home, or at least majority of our marriage, we've worked from home and we've homeschooled, there's a lot of upkeep that we all have to participate in to keep the house in order, particularly for me, because I'm easily visually overwhelmed. I'm a very visual processor. If there's visual clutter, my brain literally shuts off. And that's hard when you have to work from home. So when I've got someone who's like leaving stuff out and I keep asking like, hey, can you pick up after yourself? Like, and it doesn't happen. Like that was causing a lot of issues in our marriage because again, I didn't know of my neurodivergence. I didn't understand my visual overstimulation. And I started to take it personally. Like this mofo doesn't give a shit about me. I've asked him multiple times. Then it becomes an issue in the marriage. And when I realized it was an ADHD trait, I was like, oh, his brain literally doesn't see it. And when he could also not feel shame about his wife constantly nagging him, and he was like, it's just the ADHD, or whatever, like whatever it is. It's just like, okay, now we can better support each other. Now we can actually have quality conversations about what's going on, and we're not attributing, untruths to each other and having these issues.
So you've said a couple of things that I kind of want to recap for our listeners. Number one, not that you didn't say these words, but what I heard you say is there was power in owning that you're neurodivergent and accepting it and normalizing it. There
Yeah.
was power in owning it. The second thing I'm hearing is because you live in a family of neurodivergence, it's not about learning to navigate your own neurodivergence. It is that, but it is additionally learning how to navigate the neurodivergent traits of each individual family member because
Right.
each of you are an individual and you show up differently.
Can I add something brief to that?
Please.
This was a really healing moment for me because my whole life I grew up feeling like my dad was very emotionally neglectful and unavailable. And my oldest son is a lot like my father, like very, very, very similar. And my dad lives in California. My son was raised in Nashville and then Florida. So they've seen each other maybe once a year his whole 14 years. Not enough for him to learn behaviors because he was around the guy, but he is so much like my dad. And once I realized the genetic, components, I'm like, oh, this is probably passed down. And it all clicked and I was like, oh my gosh, my dad has autism. Brilliant guy, high IQ, autistic as hell. And he has a lot of alexithymia, like he just doesn't experience emotion the same way. And it wasn't because he was an asshole. I was like, it's just him. It's just he just has autism and he does love me and he does the best that he can. But he has, I mean, he's turning 76 tomorrow. He's a 76-year-old man that's never even given the opportunity to consider that he might be neurodivergent and also very, very highly brilliant. But like the whole conversation of alexithymia and like not really having that emotional depth, that overshadowed our relationship my entire life up until the last year. And even though I had forgiven him and made peace with that and really had done a lot of healing in our relationship, something about understanding the neurodivergent piece snapped it into view for me in a way that was like, oh, bless his heart. Like now I have even more compassion for the guy because he's just doing his thing, you know?
Yeah.
Like it just
What
doesn't
a
hurt him to call me. It's not because he doesn't love me.
yeah. What
Just,
a gift for both of you.
yeah. So to your point, it really is like not just managing the immediate family, but like even the experiences of, trauma, I guess we would call it like a low key trauma that I've carried my whole life. And I'm just like, oh, how different would it have been if we had just known like dad has autism and he's just not always this like bubbly. That's just who he is. Then I would have had a much more rounded, grounded understanding, as a child of how we fit together as a parent-child team.
You know,
Yeah.
it really is important to normalize this topic.
Hmm.
I mean, there's many topics in the world that we need to normalize, but this is definitely things that we just don't talk about. We avoid this topic. We avoid talking about death or sex or shame. We just there's a whole bunch of things we avoid, but this is one that would behoove us to normalize in whatever way we can. And it sounds like you have done that in your life and in your family, and it's made a world of difference, hasn't it?
Yeah. I love it. I mean, I think even just observing differences, and my oldest son has a dear friend who has autism, and he's got a pair of twin sisters who also have autism. And his parents are a little bit older than my husband and I. So just generationally, a little bit more probably of the generation where autism was a problem, and it was spectrum disorder. It wasn't like, hey, we're neurodivergent, which is kind of, I feel like, how things are starting to shift. And so I can tell even in just the way that like my son's friend and his sisters show up with this felt shame because of how the parents, you get a diagnosis and the parents, oh no, my kid, there's something wrong with my kid. And the kids feel that,
Mhm.
they receive that. And and I'm like, man. And then I see my son who's like, I'm here, want to be my friend, or like, and he doesn't, it's not even a thing. We do have to be like, hey, like you're neurodivergent, buddy. So like these things might be a little more challenging, but like it's not a big deal because everyone has got something, right? And not using terms like disorder and things like that. I don't get it. It's just I think we've been duped collectively by God love them, the medical establishment trying to do their best, but not having it.
Well, I think it's also important to spend some time focusing on the superpowers that come along with neurodivergence. Because I
Absolutely.
have yet to meet a neurodivergent that did not have some kind of amazing superpower. And most of all the ones that I've met have just this genuinely gentle, kind soul.
Yeah.
Just just so naturally loving, like it's effortless.
And very trusting, very, very trusting. But I totally agree with you. I mean, I think that you hear this a lot, particularly in parent advocacy groups. They're like, why are we focusing on what my child can't do? Why aren't we focusing on what they can?
Yes.
But our educational systems aren't set up that way. So, but I love the fact that there are more conversations like this happening because, more people have to this sounds, wow, this sounds arrogant. I was going to say, more people have to be in the place that I'm at with it. That didn't come out right. But I hope that more people can not have shame around it and champion it and not see it as some sort of problem. Because the more people that can, then that starts to push back against the systems and they start to change.
So let's back up for a minute and apply everything you've shared with this whole concept of becoming. You
Mm.
have become a person who has accepted, you have become aware of your own and your family's neurodivergence.
Mhm.
You have become a person who has normalized it.
Yep.
You have embraced it. You have owned it. There's a lot of pieces of becoming. Do you have anything, what I've summarized, but do you have anything that you want to add to the list of things that you've become in this process of moving gracefully into just being the neurodivergent that you are?
Mm. I um I said this at the beginning of our conversation. It just feels like coming home to yourself. It just feels like I've been, and not to say that I haven't had a good life and had many amazing experiences, even if I was operating a little bit like outside of my most authentic self. But there's a level of peace and self-satisfaction that exists when you do come home, there it's just like, oh, I can understand now why things in the past haven't worked out. I was having a conversation with a neighbor this morning, and there are a number of, we live in a very different neighborhood than when we lived in a very, very creative neighborhood in Nashville. We're in a very traditional neighborhood in Florida now, and we're not really around our people. And I was mentioning to my husband right before we got on this conversation, I was saying, it's funny, we came down here so excited. Like this was the first time we were living in like a neighborhood with a lot of kids, and we were going to make friends because, we have a wonderful group of friends in Nashville, but sometimes when you live in entertainment hubs, there's always this undercurrent of like competition. And that can be
Mm.
a little, especially again, to a neurodivergent system, that can be very exhausting. It's one of the reasons we left and wanted to try Florida for a little while. But now we're not around our people. So it's like this push pull. But so I was saying, we were really excited to make all these new friends. And we did, and as quickly as we did, we repelled some people, and people were repelled by like, it wasn't like this explosive thing. It was just like, I can't go deep with them, or we just don't click, or whatever it is. And it
That's
just,
tough.
it is tough, but at the same time, the understanding the neurodivergence piece, becoming someone who is very at home with themselves, I'm also okay with being like, I'm not for everybody. And again, this comes across sounding arrogant, but like I am a very, very deep person. And so most people can't meet me there, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get it. You get
I get
it.
it
And that's
completely, man.
okay. And so and my husband, he's a musician, and he likes tennis and he'll watch football games and stuff, but like he's like, what am I going to talk to these guys about? I don't follow sports, you know? And so when that's kind of the typical world you find yourself in, which a lot of neurodivergent people that are a lot like particularly creative neurodivergent people, they're like,
I've lived in that world my whole life. And
yeah,
and being a gay male in the gay male community, it has been I have been on the outside looking in my whole
yeah,
life. I have found few people that would get into those deeper and meaningful conversations. Few over I came out 46 years ago. Long time.
yeah.
Well, and
When it
the
was not
trick is
normal.
just adjusting the frame.
Absolutely.
I mean, it makes all of those exchanges that you can have that dip below the surface that much more precious.
Yeah. And it's
Yes.
it's statistically more challenging. We were having this conversation, my oldest son, because we're waiting, in the state of Florida, they have some amazing scholarships. And if you can prove that you have unique abilities, then you get like 10 grand a year from the government to homeschool or private school or whatever you need to support your education. So we're in the process of getting him full scale IQ and all the things. So we can show the government like, hey, give us 10 grand.
Mhm.
And so we were talking to him because, he doesn't really have a lot of friends, but he also is very self-satisfied and doesn't seek a lot of social stimulation right now. But my husband and I are very social people, so it's a little bit like, oh, like, do we worry? Right? But then we were saying, if you look at like where his IQ is compared to the percentage of the population who also is in that same range, there's only 9% of the population that are, at that place, right? Like, so it is statistically going to be more challenging for people that are, neurodivergent to find their people.
Yeah.
Um, so, that is another piece of the puzzle where it's like, oh, okay, it's okay. Like it's just a statistics problem. It's not a me problem.
So, Lindsay, for the listener that may be now questioning themselves and wondering, could this be me? If they're listening to all of our conversation and realizing that they have perhaps some traits that fall within everything we've discussed, would you recommend that they get tested?
I think
I
that's
mean,
totally a personal choice. I went through a battery of online and we had talked about me giving you the links so you guys can put that in the show notes. So I'll make sure you guys get the links to all the online tests, but there are a number of really, really well researched and well recommended from people that are more expert in this field, far more expert in this field than I am. But I did like 10 or 15 different online uh,
self-assessments?
self-assessments, and it gives you a range. And then there's a number of them that say, okay, well, you've fallen within your score is 68, and people that usually fall within 60 and 70 or whatever are 80% chance of getting diagnosed with autism. You know what I mean? So some of them have some statistical reference data, which is kind of nice. But for me, I personally don't need it. I don't work in the corporate world where I need accommodations, or anything like that. So I think it's a personal decision. Everybody is very, very different, but I do know, particularly for people who are late diagnosed and coming to an understanding of their neurodivergence later in life, the neurodivergent community is very accepting of self-diagnosis.
Mhm. Well, that'll be a valuable resource. I know that our time is drawing to a close. Um, is there anything that you'd like to share with our listeners that we haven't had a chance to get around to?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel like we covered a lot of ground.
We did.
Yeah,
This was absolutely amazing.
yeah, it was. I'm really excited to be having this conversation with you
I,
guys.
I hope my genuine hope is that this one conversation um, opens doors for many listeners, that they saw or heard something that sparked them, gave them some insight into themselves, and hopefully people can find their way to that place of accepting, owning, and learning to navigate more effectively.
Yeah, that would be my hope too. I guess that spawned a thought, so I will leave this one. But I think
Sure.
the reason why we have so much shame and so much self-loathing and so much, dealing with like internal stuff that just doesn't feel good is because we're all operating in a system where we're trying to compare ourselves to and Dwight, you've said this really well multiple times. It's a cultural expectation that really is not relevant to anyone,
Hmm.
especially in this day and age. And so we've all lived under this for so long that like collectively we just believe, well, this is the highest and best, is all these systems that we've built. And so if we don't fit in those systems, there's something wrong with us rather than the system is kind of effed or maybe totally effed, because it's not serving humanity. It's serving a very, very narrow aim. So
I
that,
would support that statement
yeah, I think
completely.
that's what I would want to leave people with.
I grew up in a school system in the 60s and 70s that did not support my primary way of learning.
Oh,
And it
yeah.
was and it was very difficult,
Mhm.
very difficult. I'm
Mhm.
surprised I even did as well as I did, and I was a C student at best.
Yeah. Yeah. And you probably, that probably informed your sense of self for a long, long time.
It did. And I've never had an IQ test, but I'm quite intelligent. Nobody
Right.
needs to tell me that. I'm quite
Yeah.
intelligent.
And that I can appreciate that because it is a weird inner tension when you go through. I was the same way. I found my college or my high school transcripts and I was like, huh, I did better than this in high school. And yet I was like in these AP classes, like really working hard for my C, but then also going, but I'm smarter than these kids. I don't get it.
Hmm.
And then there's this weird internal dissonance because you're like, not adding up. But everyone says this is the
Mhm.
measure of my intelligence, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's effed.
It's totally effed. And on that note,
Lindsay, thank you. Thank you for this conversation. This was absolutely, it just couldn't have been any better.
Yeah, we really enjoyed it.
that's so sweet. Thank you. I had so much fun. I always have a blast with you guys. So thank you again for having me.